In this lesson, you're going to learn about the hypothetical loanable funds market. Another word for it might be theoretical. It's a market that connects all of the savers in the world with all of the borrowers and determines the real interest rate. And the real interest rate, again, is theoretical. There isn't just one real interest rate. But in theory, the real interest rate is the lowest interest rate in the economy. So it will be below even the federal funds rate or the discount rate. So this video is going to be just on the loanable funds market and on interest rates, and there will be a separate video on the relationship between nominal and real interest rates. So first of all, when we talk about interest rates, we want to stop and think, what are they even? What is an interest rate? So an interest rate is the price paid for the use of money. This price can be paid by a consumer, by a business, by a bank, by the government. Anybody who's borrowing money from somebody else is presumably going to pay an interest rate, and anybody who is lending money to someone else is going to receive that interest rate as payment, or going to receive interest calculated as a percentage of the amount owed. So when you have money, the interest rate is the opportunity cost of not lending it. That means if I have $1,000 and I have it sitting in a desk drawer at home, if the interest rate is 5%, then I am giving up that 5%, $50, 5% of the $1,000 by not having the money in the bank. If I don't have any money, the interest rate is the cost of borrowing. So if I borrow $1,000 from someone else at an interest rate of 5%, I know that I have to pay them back. So when we say interest rate, which one do we mean? There are so many interest rates that get talked about. The discount rate, the federal funds rate, the yield, which is another word that means the amount paid back on short-term securities or government bonds, or the yield on long-term securities like 5-year treasuries. Or what about the prime rate, the rate paid by the best qualified borrowers like big corporations, or the mortgage rate, which people pay when they're buying a house, or credit card rates, which tend to be like 18 or 20% or even higher. Or is it what the bank pays you on a deposit, so a fraction of a percent? Or is it what you pay the bank? So the answer is, it's all of the above. These interest rates are all tied together. They rise and fall together. So if you imagine the real interest rate, the theoretical real interest rate as your pinky finger, and you drag your hand down, if the real interest rate is falling, all the other interest rates are your other fingers and your thumb. So one falls, they all fall. One rises, they all rise. And they might not do so perfectly or perfectly in sync, but they will all have a tendency to move in the same direction. What you pay or what you are paid in any particular situation of borrowing or lending money depends on the risk. So if you're lending money to someone who you're not sure is going to pay you back, you probably charge them a higher interest rate. Maturity, meaning how long do they have the money for? Is it a 15-year loan? Is it a 30-year loan? The loan size, are they borrowing 100,000? Are they borrowing $1 million? And there's all kinds of other things like, is the loan taxable? Is it a perfect market? So there might be somebody super reliable who would be a great prospect for me to lend money to, but they live in Rwanda and it's not very easy for me to transfer money there and do the appropriate background checks. And of course, profit margins, which means banks are going to always charge borrowers more than they're going to pay lenders because that difference is where their profit comes from. And then inflation, which, as I said, we'll talk about in the next video. The loanable funds theory of interest looks at this real interest rate, examines it very closely, and considers it as a function or an intersection of the supply and demand of funds available for lending and borrowing. This market, unlike the money market, is not controlled by the Fed. The Fed does not have a whole lot of power over the loanable funds market. So we talked about this before, that financial markets exist to connect savers and borrowers. So if I put money in my local community bank, whether it's Bremer Bank or TCF Bank or US Bank, that money is connected to a larger financial system, and it might be borrowed by somebody who, wants to start a business in New York or in Florida, or somebody who wants to buy a home in California. So the financial markets connect the people who are saving money and are willing to make it available, and the people who need to borrow it for whatever purpose. And we have here, this is our loanable funds market graph. we have on it the real interest rate, which is the y-axis because that's the price. And on the x-axis, we have the quantity of loanable funds. The supply and demand curves look just like supply and demand for apples or oranges or haircuts or hot dogs. Just an upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve. So, what are the things that fit into this, and what are the things that are going to be the determinants or the shifters? So, the supply of loanable funds, which, as I said, is an upward sloping supply curve, very typical. It's savings. So it's coming from anybody who is saving money. So who are the savers? Well, households, right? So anybody who's earning money might be, consuming, say, 80% of their income and saving 20%, or consuming 90% and saving 10%. The higher the interest rate, so low interest rate here, right? High interest rate here, the higher the interest rate, the more likely people are to actually save their money. So we've had really low interest rates in the American economy for a long time. We haven't really seen this. Savings rates have been pretty low. But if we saw interest rates go from where they are right now, which is like 0.01%, right? If suddenly we were getting like 5% interest rates on our savings accounts, that would not be a shift. That would be, a lot of people would say, well, I guess maybe I should save more of my money and spend less because now I can actually earn something on it. So changes in what's called thriftiness, or just overall habits or attitudes around saving, that will shift the curve. So if Americans suddenly become more concerned about retirement, for example, they might decide to put more money into savings accounts, and that would be a rightward shift of the loanable funds curve. Excess reserves in banks are also part of the supply. So we learned about excess reserves already, and the more money, if the Fed, for example, decides to buy bonds from banks and build up excess reserves, that would shift the supply to the right and lower the real interest rate. Foreign dollars are also part of this. So that capital inflow, if money is coming in, for example, from China, right? More people in China might want to put their money in our banks if we have a higher interest rate, which is why they will then also increase their demand for US dollars. And then business profits. So business profits are part of the supply of loanable funds too. And remember, hypothetically, if the government ran a surplus, that too would become part of the supply of loanable funds. But we generally don't run government surpluses, so that's really not part of our supply. The demand for loanable funds comes from anybody who wants to borrow in order to buy something. So anytime somebody wants to buy something that they can't buy with the income they currently have. So this demand is coming from businesses, so it partly is investment, right? And if there's shifts in the investment demand curve that we talked about all the way back at the beginning of Unit 3, those shifts in the investment demand curve are also going to cause shifts in the loanable funds demand curve. Also, households borrowing for what we call interest-sensitive consumption. We know most consumption is driven by income, but some consumption is actually interest-sensitive. Homes, cars, college education, anything that people typically borrow to buy. And then also the demand comes from government. So we talked about this in Unit 3. When the government borrows to deficit spend, it increases its demand in this market, and that drives up interest rates, which of course is what leads to crowding out. So shifts in the demand for loanable funds can happen for many reasons, right? Anything that would shift the investment demand curve, like changes in business opportunities, new innovations in the business technology, perhaps a change in the business cycle, businesses are feeling more optimistic, anything like that is going to shift the demand for the loanable funds. And changes in government borrowing are going to shift demand for loanable funds. And anytime, as you can see here, demand for loanable funds shifts to the right, interest rate rises. The supply of loanable funds, the primary shifters are going to be changes in private saving behavior, perhaps opening your country to more capital inflow, increased stability in a country. If a country was considered unstable, now it's more stable. There might be more foreign investment dollars flowing in. And of course the opposite can happen as well. If there's a political crisis and people pull their funds out of a country, that would cause the supply of loanable funds available to people in that country to shift to the left. Nominal interest rates we're going to return to in the next lesson, but just a brief note about them before we close this lesson. Nominal interest rates, if you recall, build in inflation. So a nominal interest rate is, for example, what's advertised at the bank. We have, for example, loans available at 6%. And that 6% might be taking into account that we're expecting inflation, so expected inflation of 2%. So the real interest rate would be 4%. The next video will address more specifically this equation, which is called the Fisher equation.